Alors, Jérémy,
Bonjour
c'est à
Michel.
toi. Bonjour. Merci d'être ici.
Thank you for inviting me. I will talk about a French vineyard because, as you can hear, I come from France. I'm here in the hot climate panel,
I
but I
know.
could have been in the cool climate panel, but I'm not going to be too greedy as I'm in two panels. I'm going to speak about Hermitage. So I've conducted 2 years ago a climate assessment about the vineyard of Hermitage. So a few words on Hermitage. Hermitage is a 136 hectares vineyard facing south in northern Rhone, 45th degree latitude north, sheltered from the wind and with the moderating effect of the Rhone. And basically my focus was on two things. So qualitative research, climatic research. So basically I'm going to go fast on the methodology, but I gathered data, daily data on the 40s past years. So 75 to 014, sorry. And then I focused on two future time slices, so 2030 and 2080. Basically you calculate averages, you calculate the main bioclimatic indices to see what's happening, and the main evolutions, obviously. And then I talked with almost all the producers to see what they observed and what they're planning to do. And the results were quite surprising. I've heard lots of alarming things this morning. And in the two panels, I will speak about solutions because I think there's lots of things to do. And actually in Hermitage, what I've heard and what I've calculated was so far so good. And in the future, it might be still possible to produce great wines and to produce great wines with Syrah and with Marsanne and with Roussanne, which I think is good news. So basically a few facts. During the period 75 to 94, it used to be a temperate climate. And nowadays we are in a temperate warm climate, which actually for Syrah might even be more suitable. And if you look at the past vintages, I think there's been an increase of more than 2 degrees Celsius on the average daily temperature. In the meantime, we have much more good vintages and less bad ones. So that's probably not only due to climate, that's due to viticulture, to techniques, etc., to the knowledge of producers, but also due to climate, I think. So in terms of climatic conditions, there's been a quite dramatic change because 2 degrees is a lot, but it's better than it used to be. In the future, what you can see when you look at the predictions, and there's usually 3 different IPCC scenarios used when you look at the future. For any of these scenarios, there will be more dramatic change. So basically, it will be drier, it will be warmer, and you will have more unpredictable climatic spells. In almost all the cases, it will become in 2080, because 2030 is still quite close, it will become a warm climate. Yet it will be less warm than in many regions which grow Syrah, Marsanne, and Roussanne and are still successful. So I believe the historical vineyards can still produce great wines in the future. When it comes to the producer, and it's probably the most interesting part, I think they're very aware of what's going on, and they're already implementing lots of things. And it's true for all the production parts. It's true for vegetal material. They're working on massal selection, on clonal selection. Basically, they're trying to isolate new individuals with a delayed ripening period. They're working on soil management. They're usually plugging less late during the seasons. They're trying to monitor the ratio, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is probably one of the most important topics with regards to climate. They're working on canopy management. So usually it's a delayed leaf removal. It's also in Hermitage, they have that technique which is called the bridge technique. So basically they tied two adjacent plants together to increase the shadow effect and have a more important folio surface. So lots of things can be done in the vineyard and in the winery. So I believe the producers have a sound empirical understanding of what's going on, and they already have solutions for the future as well. They mention bioindicative plants, they mention new massal selections, they mention back crossings as well, the potential to potentially recreate a Syrah sister, back crossing Dureza and Mondeuse, for instance. So lots of things to do, and we can make it. Thank you.
That's very good news. I have a quick question for you. How is it different? And I know, of course, the climate is different and it's different soil, but when you go to the Southern Rhone and you talk to producers who have Syrah, which is much warmer, some producers like the Beaucastel family, they're now replanting Counoise instead of Syrah because they find that Syrah is suffering. So is it something that they haven't understood, or is it just because it's different soil, different situation? How is it that the prediction for Hermitage is not as difficult?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you a small anecdote about Syrah and Châteauneuf-du-Pape. A very famous producer in Châteauneuf called Henri Bonneau said, in Hermitage, Syrah has the taste of terroir. Here, it has the taste of Syrah. So I think when you go south of Montélimar, Syrah is probably not the best grape to grow, or at least not the dominant one. I'm not sure you have to change the grapes. I think you can still produce very good Grenache in the future. And we were discussing the issue earlier. I think Grenache is produced in a fresh way in other places and in other warm places. The problem we have in France is that we focus on that so-called phenolic ripeness, and we pick the grapes quite late. And so we have these wines with 15% ABV. And I'm not sure it's the only solution. If you take a plane and go to Swartland is very warm, it's very dry. They have the Cape Doctor, which is a very dry wind, and yet they produce very elegant Grenache. So it's possible to do so in very warm place. The only thing is you need to pick earlier, and then you need a softer extraction, which can be done, I think, in Châteauneuf as well.
Merci. Allison, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you all, and I commend you for bringing together such a diverse group. I've learned so much, and I can't wait to take it back to California. I come from a public policy and environmental nonprofit background, so quite different from most of the speakers here today. But I've had the privilege of working with California vineyards and wineries over the last 15 years on sustainable wine growing. And of course, along with that, watching vintners and growers and also regional groups in our statewide organization deal with climate change issues along the way. And I remember about 10 years ago, I started hearing this link between climate change and wine, more and more being asked about it by journalists, really wondering to myself, why are we focusing on wine when this is also an agricultural issue and it's food security, and it's all these bigger issues? But it's become more and more clear to me how inextricably linked wine quality is to the environment, to the climate and weather and other things. So it's clear that we're sort of, in a way, the canary in the coal mine. And I also think we're really a unique agricultural product. So the wonderful thing is that people do want to learn about it. The last panel talked a little bit about this, but people really are curious about how wine is made. They come and visit. In California alone, we have 23.6 million tourists who visit our wineries each year. So I think our responsibility and the work that we're doing on climate change and sustainability has that broader reach, and we have a responsibility to share what we're learning with the rest of agriculture and society. So a couple of things that I wanted to touch on how I see California really addressing climate change, both mitigation but also adaptation. And one is diversity. One is climate change leadership as a state and as an industry, and then also those links between sustainability and climate change. So first, on diversity, we have 4,000 wineries in California, about 5,900 growers. We grow 100 different varietals in 139 different American viticultural areas. So there's a lot of diversity. It's a very big state. So the soils are different, the weather, the climate, even water availability, those types of things, which matter and make any generalizations about climate change really difficult. And in any solutions, likewise, very local in nature. In terms of our leadership, California as a state, someone mentioned earlier our renewable portfolio and how we have this goal by 2045 to be 100% renewable. We have the 2006 climate, it's the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think it would have been climate change if it were a few years later. And as part of that, we have a cap and trade system where some of the funding is used and put back into agriculture. So we have some of our wineries participating in things like the Healthy Soils Initiative that's all about composting and the types of cover crops you use and your irrigation and making sure that you are really building and maintaining healthy soils, which can in turn sequester carbon. We also have a program that's about the connection between energy and water, the SWEEP program that came about during the drought years. That's again a way of really focusing on water conservation, but those linkages to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So as a state, we're there. As a statewide organization, we've done a lot of work working with international partners to develop an international greenhouse gas protocol so that we can be using a common measurement system. We've worked on things like measuring the carbon footprint of California wine with a lot of our winery partners. We've worked on metrics and all kinds of different educational tools and resources for our growers and vintners. And so I think that has really been cutting edge. We're looking ahead. One thing we haven't worked on as much is really having that granular understanding about how climate change will impact certain regions, certain varietals. And so we have a proposed project right now to work with the U.S. Department of Agriculture Ag Research Service, and they have a climate hub that's based in Davis, California, we're hoping to work with. And I'm learning the names of other scientists who've been here that I would also like to bring into the fold, so a lot more ahead. And then there's also things that NAP has done to understand the impact in their particular region. Sonoma wine growers just recently announced that they're going to be piloting a certification program for carbon farm prints. So there's a lot of things going on, and of course at the individual vineyard and winery level as well. So the final thing I wanted to talk about was the link to sustainable wine growing. And I do think that sustainability is a really great approach for finding solutions to climate change, in part because it is so comprehensive, far more comprehensive than organic, which we've talked about a little bit today, which really does focus on pest management and soil management to some extent. But sustainability deals with air quality and energy use and water use and so many other topics that really are tied directly to climate change. And Wine Institute and the California Association of Wine Grape Growers created a sustainable wine growing program, free educational tools and resources available to all growers and vintners in the state. It's really set the groundwork for a number of other sustainability initiatives around the world. And again, we work in collaboration with New Zealand and South Africa and many of the other places where they have sustainability programs. So I always like to say wine is actually a sustainable beverage of choice. If you're going to be looking at beer, spirits, and wine, wine is truly an agricultural product, and we're really taking responsibility. And then we've also developed a certification program. We now have 85% of all of California wine being made in a certified sustainable winery. And also we have about 40% of our acreage certified to our program or to one of the other vineyard certification programs. And all of this, I think, is a way of collecting information, best practices, being able to disseminate that, and helping growers develop strategies to be resilient, to be able to adapt. And then the last thing I just want to mention in the context of the warm climate, we think that drought and wildfires are two of the most significant things that happen in warm climates, and California certainly is no exception. I know there's been a lot of attention paid to our recent fire, the Kincaid fire, which is now completely under control. Sonoma is back open for business. Fortunately, most of the grapes were in, so we don't expect an impact to our 29 vintage. And we also know that because of the moisture content, often vineyards act as a fire break, and so very few wineries had damage. We've lost two, but the rest had minimal damage. So there are lots of things that we can do in the area of water, drought, and also in wildfire prevention and preparedness. But all of it is also thinking about economic impacts. So one thing, we talk about all of these different climate change impacts, but this is an example of where we need people to come to Sonoma. Tourism is so important. We need people to continue to drink this wine. And so I think when we think about it, we have to think about how will climate change impact our distributors? How will it impact consumers and the ability for them to continue to enjoy the wine? In addition to how do we evolve and adapt and be resilient? So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Allison, thank you so much. I have to say, Allison has been amazing. She's been sending me so many emails. I don't know how many links you sent me, but it's very comprehensive information, but also in-depth information. I will put them on my website of Tasting Climate Change because I think they're so fantastic. There's one thing that really, many things captured my interest. One of them was that you have put a system that people can measure their carbon footprint. But with that, I was also reading that it's not that easy when you go and look, because there's so much unknown yet of the carbon footprint in the vineyard, the consequences of all the practices in the vineyards of the carbon footprint. So my question to you is, if you put a tool out there to measure the carbon footprint, yet there's so much unknown yet of the carbon, the CO2, how do you track it? You know what I'm saying?
Right, so some of it is relatively easy to track. Fossil fuel use is the biggest one, so the gasoline that you're putting into your tractors, for instance. The water that you're using for irrigation has an electricity cost associated with it. So there are some things that are easier to track. There are other things that we've been able to work with scientists to model. So we've used this, it's called the decomposition and denitrification model, DNDC.
Yes.
And at first we were just looking at, we know certain practices are going to help either reduce emissions or increase carbon sequestration. So we have some directional guidance that we came out with pretty early. But when it comes to the calculations, these models can help simulate what is basically the nitrogen flow, the CO2 equivalent flow through the vineyard based on certain practices. So we're able to pull in some of the climate data, some of the water data, soils data that's publicly available, and then we were able to add some really simple models so that you could add, how much do you irrigate, what are the cover crops that you use, what is the acreage, that type of thing. And so there are some ways that, while it may not be specifically precise, you can start seeing what are the management practices and what type of impact do they have.
Have you seen an increase of people using it and reducing the carbon footprint since you gave that tool to the producers?
Yes, so actually, interestingly, when we first came out with it, it was an educational tool. It still is, anyone can use it. And actually, almost all of our information is just publicly available, so please take advantage of all of it. But we do now require it for vineyards and wineries getting certified. So wineries have to measure their greenhouse gas emissions, water and energy use. And then on the vineyard side, they have to be measuring their water use and applied nitrogen, which is really the biggest impact in the vineyard in terms of your carbon footprint.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Anne Dumont from Lallemand. People often don't want to talk about it, but the reality is the alcohol is going up. A lot of things are happening in the winery as a result of the climate change, and especially in warm climate. Can you talk about some of the work that Lallemand has done in that regard and the tools available to producers?
Yes, thank you for the invitation, Michelle. It was really fun having nerdy talks with you about science on the phone preparing for this. And in the 20 years plus that I've been working for Lallemand, first as a microbiologist in the research and development department, I've seen I've seen a big shift in the type of selections and characterization that we've been doing. In the past, what we used to do is a lot of what we call terroir selection. So we would go in different terroir, different cellars, and swab everywhere and take samples back and study the microorganisms that we would find and characterize characterize them and trial them in different varietals and different regions, and to understand how they would work and how they would impact the wine. And with the push from, and the questions from winemakers and Wine Research Institute that for the last 10, 15 years that we've been having is really help us solve some issues that we're having. You mentioned high alcohol level. This is like the holy grail of any yeast microbiologist, to find a wine yeast that will reduce the level of alcohol. The reality is that all wine yeasts produce more or less the same level of alcohol, so it's been really, really difficult to find a wine yeast that would naturally do so. There are some techniques that you can use to use it, but during fermentation, wine yeast is pretty basic. And what happens during climate change and also severe weather events is that the microorganism, they don't have time to adapt to those situations because it happens really quickly, and it really takes many, 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 many generations for those microorganisms to adapt, a little bit like we've evolved throughout the millennials and so on. And so it's the same thing with microorganisms. And so what we've been doing in collaboration with the INRA in Montpellier, for example, is trying to put the yeast under a stress that will make it adapt faster, and instead of producing more ethanol, it would produce more glycerol. So you kind of redirect, and I'm not going to go into all those, pentose phosphate pathways and so on, but you kind of redirect their carbon flux so that instead of going to ethanol, it goes to glycerol, and it produces some acids also. But the results are interesting, like we can decrease from 0.3 to 0.8% alcohol, but it's still not what the winemakers are looking for. They're asking us like minimal 1% reduction in alcohol level, which would make it interesting. But some of them, their alcohol levels are so high that they're pretty happy when they can reduce from 14.5 to 14 or below 14. Some other issues that the winemakers are facing also, and it's related to alcohol levels, because you end up with really high sugar in the grapes at the detriment of acidity, and it's the lack of freshness and higher pHs and lower acidity. And there's two problems associated with that. When you have less acidity, less freshness, then it becomes a sensory problem and the wine is unbalanced. And you would know more about that, those of you who are producing wine. And so how to balance that back without adding like tons of chemicals like tartaric acid. And so we've been studying the yeast. I'm sure most of you know that the yeast that does the alcoholic fermentation is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And there are other yeast, of course, that we can study, and one of them is called, that's a mouthful, Lachantia thermotolerans. And this yeast, if you use it in sequential inoculation with a Saccharomyces cerevisiae, it will produce lactic acid. So during the fermentation, you can increase your acid level, and you can do that naturally, and you have more freshness. And the other problem I was talking about with acidity is when you have higher pH, it means more contaminant in the wine. And some of those you might recognize, like Brettanomyces and Pediococcus. And that can have a real quality impact in wine. And so we've been studying, for example, with the IFV in Dijon, the use of co-inoculation, so using wine yeast and wine bacteria, Enococcus uni, or another one called Lactobacillus plantarum, and you use them together. So you do the alcoholic and malolactic fermentation together, and when you do that, it gobbles up all the nutrients, sugar and so on, in the wine, and it also has a protector or a biocontrol effect, and it doesn't allow the other bad microorganism to grow like Brettanomyces. And the results are really spectacular because Brettanomyces can be dormant in a wine bottle and can really have negative impact in wine. And so by doing this technique, you're able to control the development of those bad microorganisms. And so those are some of the problems that we've been studying. Many others, I could talk for 2 hours here just talking about the kind of exciting research projects we've been studying in the vineyard, also using, instead of using fertilizer, you can use yeast derivatives in the vineyard that can, and I'm not a viticulturist, so I apologize if I say something stupid, but you can increase the skin thickness by doing that, and I would have to show you the data. You would understand better than I would. And so natural solutions like that help overcome some of the issues that the winemakers and now what they're facing in the vineyards that can help them. So if you have any questions after, you can come and talk to me about this.
Thank you so much. I have so much questions for you, but they will be complicated and long. Thank you. Francisco, Chile today, right now? Yeah.
Yes, now Chile.
We'll speak in English though.
Yeah, okay.
If that's okay.
Whatever. Well, now I'm not talking anymore about Nova Scotia, which is quite cool. Now talking about Chile and how the climate change has been affected. Well, many of you know that Chile is a very long and narrow country between the Andes mountain and the Pacific Ocean. So we have a very cold current called Humboldt, so that has a very big influence to our climate. And the combination with having different altitudes give us the opportunity to have different vineyards and achieve different wine qualities. Again, the climate change has been affected our country. We have, like, the last 20 years or 30 years especially. Now, some varieties, then, they have some difficulties before to ripen a proper way. They have been able to ripen a proper way. On the other side, we have some areas, they have serious drought. The scarcity of water has been quite constant in the last 20 years. So the climate change has been increasing the boundaries of our grape growing region. For example, before it was like impossible to think to having like a vineyard in the Atacama Desert. Now we have, or even going to the Patagonia. Torres has a big property there, but other companies as well, and they are trying with some varieties and very successful. Even like in Chiloé Island, a place where it's quite humid and cold, now we have Montes doing some very interesting experimentation. Anyway, the biggest challenges for us right now is the scarcity of water. And it's quite important and dramatic because in some areas we don't have definitely water, so we have to adapt our management decision or our vineyards now. In addition, the weather, the climate is hotter and warmer every day, so the demand of water is even it's bigger. And now this will be like a contradiction, but we have high precipitations and at times then before we didn't have. Before, like the growing season was quite similar to California, was quite long and dry. Now we are having at stages that we didn't see rain, big precipitation, so can affect negatively to the management of the vineyard. Or also some unpredictable frost. Just to mention, the last October we have in Colchagua Valley, where you have the biggest winery in Apalta especially, where it's Montes or Casa del Apostol as a winery, a frost. So before we didn't have this kind of events. That's quite scary to say because the people is not prepared and the changes are coming quite fast. Anyway, the growers there as well, they have been reacting. It's not they are waiting for them to help them. They have been developing or adapting irrigation system, mainly with drippers. In that way, they can be much more efficient. Or also different strategy. For example, to have like a deficit irrigation. So instead of being irrigating all the root system, it's only one section. So it can be more efficient. And again, the last 15 years, they have been trying different varieties. They have different varieties to try and to think of how they can adapt in different sectors. That is mainly the private sector, so it's quite difficult to distribute that information to all the growers. Anyway, the positive, and one of the positive for me, is the extension of this area and adapt and having new ways to affront these challenges. So we have some different solutions, to mitigate a little bit the effect of the heat or to the over-ripeness of the fruit. And the first of all is the exposure, the row position. Before, like in the 80s and 90s, was very unfashioned to have the rows north to south, because it was allowing the fruit to ripen in a very proper way. However, nowadays, we are burning all the grapes. So one very ecological way to mitigate that, instead of putting a lot of water or other things, is to change a little bit the rows to northwest, southeast. So at midday, when we had the hottest time of the day, we will not have the direct sun to the fruit. So that is the first way. As Mr. Torres was saying this morning, it's only increasing the height of where is the fruit zone, we will diminish the reflection of the light. So the fruit will ripen slower or more according of what you want to do, which type of wine you want to achieve. Using new different trellis system like a sprawl, or going like a little back to the past like a gobelet. So we can be using that. We have like an area in Chile, Itata Valley, where we have the gobelet, and it's producing very quite fresh wines. It's like an irony because it's dry farming, but the wines are quite fresh. So it's using the proper technique. So the canopy can be protected. If we don't have the chance, and we have, of course, north-south, we can be using like a curtain with different mesh, so we can allow to have some sunlight and not overripe the fruit. And for me, I have to insist, is rootstock. It's crucial to use and select the proper material. We can be much more efficient if we choose a proper rootstock or another variety. I like it when Jose said this morning, then we can see of what is happening in Greece. Or we have like Sino Magro as a red variety, or Asirtico as a white variety, or going even to Turkey with Narinje as white, or Okuzgusu in the red ones. So we can be much more efficient, so only to designing, but thinking a lot ahead. Chile, it's not the exception with the fires as California or Australia, wildfires. So choosing areas where we don't have forests, we have big plantations in Chile, like in Tata Valley, to evacuate or choose where we will have these areas so we can diminish the impact of the fire. It's not only how increase the temperature and increase the demand of water, it's also the smoke. So in that way, we can be diminish the impact of different natural events.
Thank you. Before we start a bigger discussion, I would like to talk about water. It's something that I feel personally really passionate about, especially when you look into where we're going in the world. It's a bit scary. So I'm just going to share a few statistics here, and then I'll ask the question. So in a document published by the Food and Agriculture Organization in the United Nations, research shows that the world's cultivated area has grown by 12% over the last 50 years. The net increase in cultivated land is the result of irrigation. Agriculture uses currently 11% of the world's land surface for crop production and makes use of 70% of all water used from aquifers, streams, and lakes. So as 2050 approaches and the global population increases by 2 billion people, global food production is predicted to rise by 70% relative to now. So, with rapidly growing demand for food, water access will become even bigger problem, no question. So the question is, which crop will be left behind? And realistically, can viticulture be sustainable in the future where irrigation is needed, regardless of all of the technology that's happening to reduce and have irrigation that's more performant?
Well, I think grapevines, they have been able to survive like thousands of years without irrigation, so now will not be the exception. I think now we have to think a less industrial and more like insights. So just starting to choose areas or soils with more water holding capacity with higher amount of clay will be the first step, in my opinion. Diminishing the amount of plants per acre or hectare also will be very beneficial. So we'll have less consumption of water. also to develop or use the drip irrigation under the soil at the proper time and in the key stages also will give. So, and also using the proper varieties. I think we have many different options to continue producing wine in a sustainable way, but we have to be realistic, then we cannot be drinking Cabernet Sauvignon all around the world. It has to be more focused, and we have to spend more time studying that conditions.
I agree that I'm optimistic that we'll still be able to continue growing grapes in some of these regions where irrigation is necessary. I still think there's opportunity for more dry farming, and we're seeing that uptake in California, but also just increasing efficiency and what we call precision agriculture, making decisions not just with drip irrigation, which is fantastic, and I think wine grapes have led the way for many other agricultural crops, which, again, that leadership role is so important. But we're also getting better at getting down to the vineyard block, the vine itself. How much does that specific vine need? And so I just think the more we can be precise like that, that's really important. But there's also a great opportunity for water reuse. And so many wineries are now collecting the water, treating it, sometimes reusing it many times within the winery before. So this idea someone had this morning about the 6 uses of a wine bottle before, that type of thinking of how can we get the biggest bang for our buck for every drop of water. And in California, I know we have a lot of work we can do. We've controlled for flood for so long in so many areas, so we have to be thinking smarter. We have these things called atmospheric rivers, and it's really important that we manage our understanding of that really well so that we can take advantage when there is water and hold it for when it's needed. I just think, again, technology, practices, there's so much we can do. In the winery, even simple things like using a broom before you just hose down a grape into the drain. There's just many small things that can add up to big water savings.
Simply recycling rainfall, which is not done in many wineries. Yeah. I think there's also a question behind your question. The question is, what do we want for the wine industry in the future? Do we want productivity and mass market wines which are not sustainable and are produced in regions where they should not be sometimes even produced? And these regions are wasting a lot of water. Or do we want less but better? And that's a key question for the future.
Thank you. It's exactly what I was after. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Anna, we need a microphone there. I don't know where my staff went. Thank you.
Hi, once again, thanks everyone. It's very, very interesting. I don't know if this question appeals or not, so you can cut me along the way. I have the chance to work with a lot of winemakers who privilege indigenous yeast in wine in order to privilege a certain sense of place. And I was wondering, how does the climate change affect the activity of natural or indigenous yeast? And knowing that working organically is harder or not enough, with the different changes that are upon the wine world, have you seen, maybe you, Madame Dumont, an increase of winemakers reaching out for selected yeast in order to counter climate change?
First of all, the selected yeast are indigenous yeast, initially, to start with.
Maybe my English is not right. I'm talking about
indigenous fermentation, you mean?
Yeah, but des levures indigènes qui font des fermentations naturelles ou des levures sélectionnées pour faire des fermentations avec des levures. Ça marche dans ma définition des termes?
No, oui? I was being cheeky.
Okay, sorry.
Of course, I mean, when you have grapes coming in with very high sugar level, it's harder for the yeast that are found in the cellar to ferment. There's also the question, like I mentioned earlier, the question of pH. So it really depends on the type of must that is coming in, the health status of the grapes also, if there are molds or any other disease on it. It depends on the hygiene of the cellar. It depends on a lot of things. So, but the winemaker only has one chance to make wine every year. And so I think that when he feels that the conditions are not optimal, he's going to reach out for the most secure solution. It doesn't mean that the wine is going to be adulterated, is that an English word? I'm not too sure. And it's going to change. It just means that it's going to have a secure fermentation without aromatic deviation, which can be a big problem. If you have a stock fermentation, then you end up with H2S, you end up with VA, you end up with all sorts of problems. And it depends on the segmentation of your market, and maybe your consumer are not looking for that. So I think, like I said, the winemaker only has one chance to make wine every year, and he's going to take the most secure solution. But I'm not a winemaker, I'm a microbiologist, so I can talk to you about the ecology and the biodiversity that you find in the cellar, but the winemaker maybe would be better equipped to answer that question than I would.
That's the microbiologist answer, so I'll have another one, sorry. If you have a stock fermentation, then you do a pied de cuve and it works very well. So I'm not sure that's the only answer, but that's my point of view.
Thank you.
Oui, Eric? Je sais pas, sont partis où les gens? Can we pass?
Thank you, Michelle. It's a question for Allison. As you travel around the world, I see the term sustainability used to cover a multitude of sins. How does your group balance the desire to get growers and winemakers to take first and second steps with the need for them to go beyond doing just enough to be able to call themselves sustainable and to really make changes in the way they farm and vinify wines?
It's a great question. So we started off our educational program very purposeful, that we wanted everyone to be able to come in, to see themselves there, to understand how they could improve their practices. And that was really the first step, and we felt it was really important. We didn't start with a marketing program or certification. We really wanted people to understand what sustainability meant, that broad set of topics. We have over 200 plus practices covered in our Code of Sustainable Wine Growing, which was put together by the industry but was vetted by a lot of external stakeholders to make sure that it truly reflects best practices. And it's an ongoing evolution, so we're working on the 4th edition of the code now. When it comes to certification, making sure that it truly is a credible certification program that really does have meaning in terms of sustainability. We had to make sure that not only did it cover the broad suite of topics, but we had required practices that you have to meet, some stringent standards of practices you have to be adopting. We also have an overall score threshold, so you're not just doing those things you have to do, but you're looking at all of your operation and taking other steps and meeting that score threshold. We have restrictions on crop protection materials, a whole integrated pest management approach that you have to be employing, and we also have requirements for performance metrics. So all these different steps, and the final requirement is that you can't just do all of that, you have to continuously improve. And so we have third-party auditors that are doing annual audits, verifying that all the requirements are met, but that you're also looking at your own operation, because sustainability is really so site-specific, such a local thing when it comes down to it. So they want to know your methodology for looking at where your winery or vineyard has impacts, what you're doing to focus on that you're implementing action plans on an annual basis and demonstrating continuous improvement. And then finally, for the credibility piece of it, there's 2 things we did. One thing we did was have our own outside audit. So we had a group called SCS Global Services look at the ISO standards around sustainability, and another program called ISEAL, and basically make sure that we're adhering to international standards when it comes to sustainability standards or certification schemes. And that was really important. And then the other one is transparency. So every year we publish sustainability reports on our certified vineyards and wineries, and that's our way of sharing how our they're actually doing on specific practices. So you can look at all of the prerequisites and see what the scores are and the numbers, et cetera. So, and then we have our website where you can look up certified vineyards, wineries, wines. So that transparency piece is really important.
Michaela?
So my question is for Jérémy. Great news that we'll still be drinking Hermitage Syrah in years to come. However, we know there are no fixed answers, really. We don't know what's going to happen in years to come. The focus, it seems to be, is in the vineyard in the region. However, I am wondering if there is some work that's being done with other grape varieties. We see in Bordeaux the inclusion now of other grape varieties that in the past were not allowed to exist. And maybe just in general, not just in the northern Rhone, but other areas of France, because we're talking about very different traditions than you see in somewhere like California or Chile, where you have appellation regulations. And these are big changes in some respects.
Yeah, in Europe, things are sometimes a bit set in stone, I'd say. So it's difficult to move the lines, especially in historical vineyards such as Hermitage. It's a very small one as well, so that probably explains why they didn't experiment other grapes as it's done nowadays in Bordeaux. Regarding new grapes, once again, I'm not sure it is the right solution, but that's my opinion. I think back crossings and massa selection and new root stocks, and there's lots of other things in terms of vegetal material solutions that can be done. Once you change, if you're in Hermitage, you change the identity. And Hermitage is linked with Syrah for centuries. So the question is, do we want to drink Hermitage or do we want to drink another wine? And I hope that we will cope with the future and we will stick to Syrah. It will be different, of course. Techniques will be different and the wines will be different. They're already different. But at least we keep something, we keep an identity. If we go for another grape, then it's going to be completely different and it's not going to be Hermitage anymore. And when I discussed the issue with the producers, I was very happy because they all said, we don't want Grenache. And I was expecting some of them to say, well, let's go for Grenache. And actually they said, well, Grenache is quite low in acidity and high in alcohol, so would that be the solution? But once again, I think we could potentially recreate a sort of Syrah sister, which is still peppery, is still floral, so still has the identity of Hermitage, but more suitable to the current and the future climatic conditions.
I think it'll also be. Hi, yeah. I think it'd also be interesting to ask this question to Lilian on the last panel because he's been working with Jean-Louis Chave in that regard, and I think he's going to have some insights about the future Syrah of Hermitage. Any other question for this panel? Yes? We're coming. We're back.
Yes, so... great. Another yeast question. So part of the yeast heritage is protected by people doing your job, Madame Dumont at Lallemand. Is there a risk, though, for more niche product like the vin jaune or manzanilla, which have a little bit of uncontrolled process in their yeast evolution with climate change, or are they fairly stable for the years to come?
That's a good question. I'm not too sure. You're talking about the floor yeast, correct? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I know that many years ago, we did some studies on those, but some of those microorganisms are very hard to grow and require certain conditions for their development. And because it's such a niche, very small market, unfortunately, this has not been developed. So personally, because I like those types of wine, I would like them to develop that, but it's very, very complicated and difficult just to not propagate them, but grow them in big fermenters. It's quite an issue to grow them and dry them.
Actually, in Manzanilla, the climate is already quite warm and quite dry, so it's probably already working. So,
any more questions? Thank you so much. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.